Hello and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos, and today we're going to discuss the poetic genius of Takanashi Kiara's Martyr. So, a bit about the song. This one was released on February 7th, 2026. The lyrics were written by Moni, so therefore, as always, it's important to remember that we are discussing this as a Takanashi Kiara project, thus the poetic genius of, but we're acknowledging that the lyrics are written by Moni. As a sort of random aside, I feel like we've been covering a lot of writing lately that focuses on themes of like imprisonment, judicial systems, sort of like oppression, all of that stuff, which was totally unintentional. But I realized as I was setting this up that these songs would work really well together as a sort of cool playlist. And as always, before we really get into things, I just want to give a brief disclaimer, basically just stating that with these episodes of The Poetic Genius of, I just want to remind everyone that these are just my personal interpretations and observations, and I am by no means intending to project them onto the artists. This is sort of following the death of the author, which, in literary criticism, basically just states that once a piece of writing is published, it's no longer just the author's, and people are able to interpret it basically however they please. We all come to pieces of writing with different backgrounds, having read different, pieces of writing, seen different pieces of art. So we're going to draw different parallels and connections and things like that. So while, it's always helpful to consider authors' intent, basically we're allowed to play with interpretation and sort of find our own meaning. So some further reading, I always like to start these off with a couple of recommendations. Basically, if you like this song, like some of the themes in it, you might like these pieces of writing. And so today, I'm going to recommend The Prisoner of Chillon by Lord Byron. This is a narrative poem about tyranny and imprisonment and sort of trying to find a sense of liberty. And then we have Manfred by Lord Byron, and this one has a bit of a persecution complex in it, which sort of fits with the themes of the song, though it's not a perfect comparison. But yeah, ultimately, I primarily feel like there's something very Byronic about Kiara's attitudes in this piece, so anything by Byron will sort of fit the bill. All right, and so now I think we can pretty much jump into our close reading. So to keep things a bit more organized, we're going to at least attempt to follow the structure of reading the passage, taking a look at the rhyme scheme, and then going line by line to identify metaphor, simile, imagery, tone, etc., different poetic techniques and devices that will sort of help us figure out the theme. So with that being said, let's jump right into it. So we start off with a pretty strong first verse, which goes, "I'll be your exit route, pound the gavel and sentence me to doom, even though I'm just doing what you do. Decide which lies become the truth. No, you never really thought about it that far. Judging me when I can see you've got the same scars. That's the price I pay. It's a deep mark. Come, pick your sacrifice." So starting off, we don't have a very clear rhyme scheme. We have route, doom, do, whoa, yeah, nah. So yeah, nah kind of rhyme. We have far and scars basically rhyme, although there's that S sound. There's mark, which kind of has a similar A sound as in far, scar, mark. You can hear that A sound there. And then we have sacrifice. Also, we have to make an obligatory doom joke reference. If you know, you know. But jumping into the actual analysis, so we have, "I'll be your exit route." This is already very interesting because we're getting our first two characters. We have our sort of like narrating protagonist, let's say. And then we have the your, who's this other person. So we have a second person. And there's already a sense in terms of tone of a sort of familiarity, but also sort of scorn. So this sounds like, our I, which, we can call Kiara for the sake of ease, but, this doesn't have to necessarily be autobiographical. But we have the I, and then we have the your, so she's saying, "I'll be your exit route." So, again, it's a sort of familiar, non-formal thing. It seems like they might know each other, but there's definitely a sense of sort of scorn, contempt in it, with it sort of being, sarcastic, but in a sort of like biting way. But it's an interesting opening line because it also is sort of revealing intent, in that it seems like the Kiara, the I character, is perceiving the actions of the second person as having the objective of needing an exit route. So for some reason, the second person needs, an exit from something, needs to remove themselves from something. We don't know what yet, but the Kiara/I character is basically saying that they can be the means to the exit route, although again, I'm picking that up as being sort of a sarcastic thing. Pound the gavel and sentence me to doom. So what's interesting here is the pound the gavel seems to be sort of like over exaggerated, unless we're actually talking about a sort of judicial person. But really, I feel like with the pound the gavel, that's sort of being a metaphor for basically a larger sense of the second person having some sort of authority or power, although she's sort of belittling it with that sort of sarcastic attitude. So, sort of debrief what I just said there. So basically, there's a relationship between these two characters, and one is casting blame on the other. And so by casting that blame onto the other, they're projecting themselves as actually being higher up than the other person, because they're in the place that gets to judge the first person, when really they're probably equal. So that's where the sort of sarcasm comes from. And also, it's sort of saying you're acting like a judge, trying to pound your gavel. And also, what's interesting is the pounding of the gavel usually is done, especially in fiction, when the judge is sort of losing control, which is interesting. That's usually they pound their gavel and they go, order, order. They want everyone to silence. It's usually when there's like an outburst in the courtroom. So we're already getting a lot of context. Two people, one is judging the other, one is sort of casting blame on the other, but they're already sort of losing control, and they're doing all of this with the sort of character motivation of wanting an exit route. And then we get the sentence me to doom. So with this judgment that this person is casting, we know that it's not a casting of judgment that has no implications. So basically, if there were two people who were in, say, relationship, and one suddenly had a holier than thou mentality and was trying to cast shame and blame on the other person, if it's just isolated and it's just the two of them, this blame might not actually carry that much weight beyond breaking up the relationship between the two. But if the person does actually have some power, say they lie to their whole friend group and the whole friend group starts to blame that person, then suddenly there kind of is a sense of doom, which is sort of a sense of tension. There actually could be real world consequences to this dynamic that's occurring. Even though I'm just doing what you do, so we're getting, there's a sense of hypocrisy. But what's interesting is, in terms of, you always have to sort of question, is a narrator reliable? Are they not reliable? What's going on? All we know for sure right now is that the I person in this first sentence, they view the other person's actions as being hypocritical. Whether they are hypocritical or not, we don't know yet, but they view it that way. Decide which lies become the truth. And so also, which lies is interesting because we have to acknowledge that they're using the plural. So that means that there's a ton of lies going on right now. Maybe some are being said by the first person and some, are being said by the second person. Alternatively, it could be lies that, sort of third party collective could be putting on both of them. But now this second person is basically agreeing with the lies that shame the first person while saying the other lies are totally fictitious. So therefore they're trying to get to play this sort of judge, again, of judging which lies are true, which aren't, and they're basically forming their narrative. No, you never really thought about it that far. This is interesting because this one is sort of maybe a veiled threat by the I character, because they're basically saying, oh, decide which lies become the truth. You didn't really think about it getting that far. But the thing is because that first person also knows which are lies and which are the truth. So it's basically saying, oh, you can tell everyone what's the truth and what's not, but since I also know you're lying, I can expose you if I want to. Judging me when I can see you've got the same scars. This is a very interesting line because we usually think of scars as being, wounds and as being sort of marks of, damage, and damage being a bad thing. So, if me and another person both have, let's say, scars on our legs, and then someone says, oh, where did you get those scars on your legs? And we say, well, we were walking through these thorn bushes, and the thorn bushes cut us both on our legs. In that example, we're both effectively victims of being in a bad situation with the thorn bushes. It's not indicative of us being bad people. But here in this relationship, there seems to be a good guy and a bad guy. There's person number one who's getting, sort of prosecuted, and person number two who's playing the role of judge, but they themselves are a liar. But they both have the same scars, which makes it seem like person one and person two both went through some sort of hardship together, thus obtaining these scars. But now that they're out of that hardship, there's been a split between them. However, you could also view the scars as being sort of similar to what we would see in like the portrait of Dorian Gray, in which scars can be indicative of sort of being like marks of sin and crime. So, if you were doing a bunch of bad stuff, got into a bunch of bad fights, you were a bad guy fighting other people, but you developed scars as a result of that. In that sense, you can have scars. So I'm very curious about this, and I want to see as we, sort of progress onward with this piece, how that's going to develop. Are we going to learn that person one and two both went through a bad thing together? Because that actually makes this second person who's playing the judge, that makes them more complex than we initially saw. Because at first it just seems like it's a very simple relationship of there's two people, one's being really judgmental and mean and telling lies about the other, and the other person is sort of taking it, but in a sort of like, sort of a Byronic way of sort of like, sure, cast lies about me. Who, what do I care? It's sort of like it, rolls right off of me. Whether it does or not is, up for debate. It seems like it actually might be hurting them more than they want to let on. But if this person too has scars as well, then you could almost be saying that potentially they're reacting from like a trauma response, and their character motivations might not be as simple as just they want to hurt person number one, but maybe they have a sense of needing to survive because based on what they went through before, that kind of thing. That's the price that I pay. It's a deep mark. The price I pay for what? That's sort of the great question. We learned that, they're paying a price, but you have to pay a price for something. Usually we use that expression as sort of being a bad thing. You pay the price, you for a moment of bliss, you now pay the price of, dealing with the consequences of that, slip up or moment of easiness or something like that. So then come pick your sacrifice. This is also interesting because pick your sacrifice implies that there's multiple options, but it seems like person 1 just is the sacrifice for person 2. So I'm curious as to what kind of are the options here that are being presented. But let's jump into the next passage to see if we can learn any more. And so then we get this pre-chorus, which goes, "Nail me to your crucifix. Nothing else can fix this, so I'll take the blame. See yourself reflected and not corrected. One request, it's..." So this is already very intriguing, but to do our sort of rhyme scheme, we get crucifix, fix this, then we get corrected and reflected, and then request it's sort of rhymes with crucifix and fix this. It's that it sound, ix is, that kind of thing. But there's sort of a lot going on here for a pre-chorus. So we have nail me to your crucifix. So this is an allusion, which is basically when you're referring to another piece of writing or, major cultural milestone, things like that. So you have an allusion to Jesus, who was crucified, and basically in the Bible, Son of God, gets crucified for people's sins, and it's seen as being a sacrifice. If I can spell sacrifice. So it's being seen as a sacrifice, which hails back to that first verse, which is "come pick your sacrifice." So Jesus as a sacrificial character. The thing that's interesting here, though, is, again, there's this sort of tone of sarcasm, but again, it's like it's a very bitter sarcasm, because it's not them actually saying like, oh, like, I offer myself up, because in the Bible, Jesus, I'm not getting religious about it, but Jesus in the Bible sacrifices himself willingly. That's sort of the whole gist of it, is that it's a sacrifice made where he offers himself up to be sacrificed for the sake of humanity. But within this, I don't feel like the Kiara's character, this I character, I don't think they are actually offering themselves up with the same level of willingness, because where, one is coming from a sense of love, this seems to be like a major falling out between two people. So what they're really sort of saying here is it's almost like what they're saying is that they're comparing themselves to Jesus, and your crucifix is sort of comparing the other person, to being Pontius Pilate, who is this sort of like Roman, the Roman judge who condemned Jesus to be crucified. So again, we get this sort of judge character. And so by saying this, what they're really doing is pointing it out as being like, do you realize that in this dynamic between the two of us, I'm the Jesus character and you're the Pontius Pilate? Like, you're the bad guy here. And so that's what this comparison and this illusion seems to really be aiming at. And the reason we can tell that is also through the context clues of that first verse. There's clearly a lot of bitterness. They're saying we have the same scars. There's truths and there are lies, and you're deciding which lies are the truth. Like, they don't look up to this other person. So it isn't actually that they're being selfless as saying like, oh yeah, nail me to your crucifix if that's what's needed. If this is what will make things better, I'm willing to do that. It's much more of like, go ahead, nail me to your crucifix. Nothing else can fix this, so I'll take the blame. See yourself reflected and not corrected. One request, it's... And this seems to be leading into the chorus, which we'll look at in a second, but one has to ask, which kind of goes back to sort of the reliability of the narrator, is it true that nothing else can fix this? Or are they exaggerating and being extreme to point out the other person's hypocrisy? Because if the judge character is saying like, oh, you need to be crucified, it's the only way that this is going to be solved, whether the crucifixion is, literal or not, if you sort of like falsely agree and you're like, oh yeah, you're right, nothing else will fix this except, my total destruction and condemnation, that's the only solution here. Like, that's being sarcastic and also pointing out that actually there's probably a lot of way better ways to handle this. But now we get this question again of fix this. Well, what's this? What needs to be fixed? Again, right now, all we know is there seems to be these two characters. They share a past in some way, and now one is spreading lies about the other to sort of get them in trouble. But they're doing that to fix a problem, but what's that problem? So again, they're saying, I'll take the blame. Now, this part is interesting with the I'll take the blame, because that's where it feels very Lord Byron. So Lord Byron is a poet from the 19th century, early 19th century, one of the, key figures in the English Romantic movement, and one of his biggest contributions to sort of the writing world is the sort of invention of the Byronic hero. You might have heard this expression be used before. It's used a lot for basically characters who are sort of, they're sexy, but they're brooding, they're conflicted, they're sort of plagued by a dark and shadowy past, so they may have feelings of guilt, and they sort of have a self-destructive sense of self. So usually they sort of have the attitude of like, nothing can wash away the sins of my past. I should just, throw myself on the stones. It's the only solution, which is sort of what we see in like Manfred, which was, referenced in the further reading section. But we also see in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, in Don Juan. We just see it over and over again throughout his writing as this sort of character who's committed some sin in the past and he's brooding about it, and sort of his like guilt over it is sort of seen as sort of being sexy in its own way. Sort of like a modern example would be like Edward from Twilight is often compared to being a Byronic hero because he's a vampire, but he's sort of like vaguely disgusted by the fact that he is a vampire, and he's sort of conflicted about his feelings and emotions and all that stuff. Here, there's sort of a degree of that where this first person, who is our narrator, our sort of hero in this piece, they're mad that this other person is judging them and condemning them and, telling lies about them and all of that stuff. But they also don't fully deny it, which is sort of interesting. So again, in that first verse, they say we both share the same scars. So their issue isn't that they're being blamed. It's more their issue is the hypocrisy that the other person isn't blaming themselves as well. It's a problem that was done by two people, but only one of them is basically willing to admit it. They're willing to admit it, and that's why they're saying, I'll take the blame, but you need to see yourself reflected and not corrected. I think with here, it's sort of doing an interesting image with like glass, because you can sort of be reflected in mirror glass. So basically they're saying like, I will be the mirror version of you. So when you look at me, you should realize that you're seeing the mirror reflection of yourself. But then you can do corrective lenses with glasses to sort of fix your view of it. And what she's saying is, don't look at me and then use corrective lenses to basically see yourself as better, so you're not seeing the true reflection. Instead, you should be seeing with your, naked eyes, see the true reflection, because I am a reflection of you. What you see in me and what you think is gross or shameful or, evil, whatever word you want to use, that's, you also have those attributes, because this was sort of a crime committed by two people, let's say. So yeah, let's jump into the chorus then. So then we get our chorus, which goes, don't be gentle, don't be kind, when you murder, murder, when you murder the martyr, poke their eyes out, leave them blind, murder, 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 one request, it's. So here we have the repetition of the sound of murder, and then we have repeating sounds with the M's, murder, the martyr. But we don't really have a rhyme scheme. So, well, we have blind and kind. So there's sort of like an internal one there. Request. There's not really anything with X. The request it's, which sort of goes back to the whole fix and all of that stuff. But this one's interesting because for two reasons. One, it has that sort of repeating of that whole Jesus imagery where by calling herself the martyr and saying that what the other person is doing is murder, she's very much like laying out the reality of the situation. Because the other person wants to view it as like the good and noble judge and, the horrible villain. And it's sort of like, oh, this is the dynamic. And what she's doing is clarifying, no, what's actually happening is that you're murdering the martyr. And so what's a martyr? Martyr is usually, seen as someone who dies for a cause, but usually does so in a sort of innocent way. It's sort of like the innocent killing of someone based on their beliefs. So by saying that she's innocent and that, but we also sometimes see a martyr. We sometimes say like, oh, don't be a martyr. Colloquially, that's sort of like, so if someone is in a car and it's really cold with the AC and they say, oh, it's so cold. And the other person offers and says, oh, well, I can make it warmer in here. And then they say, oh, no, I'd hate to bother you. You want it to be cold so we can keep it cold. And then the other person would respond back by saying like, oh, don't be a martyr. If you're uncomfortable, just speak up. So it's sort of this like someone who's sort of a self-inflicted punching bag in a way, is sort of like almost a modern usage of the word. But then again, there's that more historical one of, the innocence in it all. Then we have this poke their eyes out, leave them blind. That feels like it could be a reference to two things. One, there's the Bible quote, which goes, and if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter, into life with one eye than have two eyes, but be cast into hell. It's basically the quote. And so with that one, poke their eyes out, eyes as being, so this is sort of sin. Their eyes is interesting because who's there? Are they basically, is this judge character casting blame on multiple people? And so it's sort of a collective sense because it's not poke my eyes out and leave me blind. But they're saying the martyr, so I think there is really referencing to the martyr, and we know that the first person in this dynamic views themselves as the martyr, but they're kind of doing an interesting sort of like, oh fine, I'll be the sheep for you, but when you kill the sheep, be kind to them. So they're sort of like, they're almost removing themselves from the role of the sheep. They're almost speaking up on behalf of the sheep. So here, the narrator is almost speaking on behalf of the martyrs while also being a martyr. It's saying like, I'll be a martyr, but hey, but before I become the martyr, make sure that when you kill the martyr, you're kind about it. But I think when they're saying don't be gentle, don't be kind, what they're saying is don't do it in a way that you feel better about yourself. Because if this judge person does it and they're saying, oh, yeah, I executed this prisoner, but I was gentle about it. I'm so kind. I'm such a good person. I'm holier than thou. Yeah, I had to, do this sentencing and this judgment. Yeah, I had to tell lies about this person, but, don't you know that it bothered me to do it? I didn't want to do it. And so here, the narrator is saying, well, don't do it gentle and kind because you need to be real about what you're actually doing. Don't lie to yourself and say, oh, you're kind and gentle. Be brutal with it because what you're doing is brutal and is brutish. So be honest about it and don't lie to yourself about it. But with the poke their eyes out, it also kind of goes to the whole idea of an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind, where, fixing a wrong with a wrong doesn't make a right is basically the whole thing. If someone pokes your eye out and then you poke their eye out, and then, you know, the cycle goes on and on and on, it'll leave the whole world blind, which feels with the whole like leave them blind. So I feel like it's, you know, safe to say that that could be a reference to that, which again has to do with the whole fact that it's the hypocrisy that's bothering our narrator, because they're saying, yeah, I did a wrong, but you need to acknowledge that you did a wrong. Don't think of yourself as this kind, you know, judge who's gentle and is a hero for what they're doing. What you're doing is murder. And yeah, maybe I've done some bad stuff too, but you know, an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. You got to acknowledge it and be not blind to the truth of the situation that's happening. So then we get our next verse, which goes, hypocrisy, I've seen what you do in private rings. All your friends, yeah, they know what you really think. To your glory, the masses keep on singing. Point at me in a hurry. Pick a scapegoat for the new controversy. Even when I'm buried, hidden, silent, you'll be wary. Please, dear God, show them mercy. And so then we have also to acknowledge that, you know, the lead up to this is one request, it's hypocrisy. So with a rhyme scheme, we have hypocrisy and rings. They both have an I sound. Hypocrisy, rings. What you really think, that kind of goes with the rings. Think and rings also kind of rhyme with each other. Singing, ing, rings, think. Hurry, controversy, hurry, controversy, depending on how you say it. Kind of a rhyme there. Wary, hurry, controversy, mercy, controversy. These two could rhyme with each other, wary and hurry. And then we kind of get almost, so it's almost like an A, B, B, C, B, C sort of rhyme scheme. Let me write that. A, B, C, B, C. So here we get it laid out exactly as I was basically guessing as we went through this line by line, is that it is hypocrisy is the issue. One request, well, what's that request? I think it's an acknowledgement that it's hypocrisy. Because again, that seems to be the thing that's really bugging our sort of narrator here. And now here they lay it out. Why do they think it's hypocrisy? Well, they've seen what you do in private rings. What's interesting is in order to have seen it, you had to be there. And if you were there, you were maybe complicit, which again is why it's hypocrisy. It's not that she's acknowledging that she's totally innocent. It's that she's saying, I was there, I was doing the bad things as well, but now you're trying to act like you weren't. All of your also in private rings as being sort of groups. So in your private little friend groups and rings, you do these bad things. And those friends of yours, since they also see it, they know what you really think. They know, you know, who you really are. And then we're getting some sort of like king analogy. And sometimes a king can be a judge. So, you know, there's like room for that sort of comparison of the judge. Now it's the king, because to your glory, the masses keep on singing. So this is someone who's, you know, praised. And whether they're actually a king or if that's sort of a metaphor and sort of an image, clearly they're praised within the circles that these two characters interact in. And meanwhile, they point at the hero in a hurry. And the reason why they say in a hurry, as we always talk about, when you only have so many words to write with, you know, in a novel, you could have thousands and thousands and thousands of pages full of words. In songwriting and in poetry, you only have so many words, so you have to make every word count. So the in a hurry is interesting because even in this short line, just point at me in a hurry, it tells us that the judgment that is being performed by pointing is being done in a hurry, which is again sort of casting doubt, because if these are judgments that are being made in a hurry, how do we know that they're legitimate? Or, you know, is it possible that they're actually judgments that are being made too rushed and aren't true. So maybe it's not fully hypocrisy in that sense. Maybe our hero is actually much more innocent. Maybe they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and so they're being judged and all this stuff, but that judgment was made in a hurry and might not be legitimate. Pick a scapegoat. That's the idea of picking someone to take the blame when really you should be taking blame for the new controversy. So what's this controversy, though? Even when I'm buried, hidden, silent, you'll be wary. Please, dear God, show them mercy. Them seems to be, someone else. Because this is interesting, though, because this sort of is another almost Jesus quote. Because there's the whole line from Jesus where he says, please, dear God, have mercy on them. They know not what they do, which is sort of like as he's being crucified, there's the idea that they don't fully know the implications. And that sort of goes out to the masses. It's less, the Romans that are doing the execution and more the masses that are gathered in humanity in general doesn't know what they're doing because they think they're just crucifying a random guy, but really they're crucifying God. So he's saying, God, have mercy on them. Don't, go about the path of revenge. But here again, it seems that, so one, that's telling us again that the hero is basically comparing themselves to Jesus. But two, similarly, they do have a sense of sort of empathy and concern for the masses that are pointing at them. Now, is this being said sarcastically? Is it being said authentically? That's a bit more difficult to say because, again, this hero definitely thinks of themselves as being somewhat similar to Jesus. They don't think they're literally God and perfect and, all that because, but they think of themselves as being at least relatively innocent and then being condemned. But does this version of them, since they're not Jesus, actually have scorn for the masses? Because, Jesus as being this perfect, person, character, what have you, they actually do have concern for the masses. But does this hero in the song? We don't know. But here's what's interesting is the other thing we don't know is pick a scapegoat for the new controversy. What is this controversy? Sort of hesitant to say this and that, I don't want to be like, every Hololive song is about a relationship or something like that, because so many of them aren't. So I don't want to give that impression. But I went into this at first whenever there's sort of a dynamic between two people. And a lot of this music, it's romantic in nature. Usually it's if there's a heartbreak or a wanting, a yearning for, something like that. So at first I thought that the sort of narrative of this was that there was this couple that had a bad breakup and now the man of the relationship is spreading all these rumors about their ex and judging them and making everyone think, the relationship broke apart because of the ex, and the ex is actually this bad person and all of this stuff. But we're getting enough sort of word choice and phrases that are indicating that this isn't that simple of a dynamic. This is actually there actually is some weight to this, since there actually is controversy. And, are they being exaggerating when they say that I'll be buried, hidden, and silent? Or, maybe this really is coming from the perspective of someone who is sort of in the story of this actually is dealing with a tyrant of a king. I think we can only really just keep reading on and seeing if we can get any more info, but I'm definitely curious as to what you guys think at this point. Are you thinking that this is all metaphor for a relationship, or do you think that this is actually a bit more literal than I initially thought? And then we have our pre-chorus and chorus, which goes, nail me to your crucifix, nothing else can fix this. So I'll take the blame, see yourself reflected and not corrected. One request, it's Don't be gentle, don't be kind. When you murder, murder. When you murder the martyr, poke their eyes out, leave them blind. Murder, 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 break me now. And as you can see, I've put the previous pre-chorus and chorus here just to point out that while these are similar, there are some differences. So here we have nail me to your crucifix, nail me to your crucifix. Then we have nothing else can fix this. So I'll take the blame. Now we have take the blame, the blame. So this blame is like further emphasized. We have see yourself reflected, and not corrected, and not corrected, one crest it's. Then we have don't be gentle, don't be kind when you. Don't be gentle, don't be kind when you. Murder, murder, when you murder the martyr. Poke their eyes out, leave them blind. Murder, murder, one requested versus murder, murder, murder. Break me now. So again, there's something interesting that's being done here where they're, again, in a sort of Byronic way, they're basically saying, do your worst and do all this bad stuff. But by doing that, again, pointing out actually the sort of hypocrisy in this interaction. So it's sort of like, I'm trying to think of an example, because I feel like I've seen this in a couple different instances in literature and movies and stuff, where a character is going to be punished in some way, and at first maybe the other person sort of chickens out, and they're basically like, no, you wanted this, you wanted to sentence me to this horrible state, so you better, like, you can't run away and turn your face from this. It's almost like if someone, again, is the judge in this character and then gets squeamish at the blood, and it's like, no, you can't like look away from the blood. In fact, you have to make it even more bloody and more horrible, because this is what you wanted, this is what you thought was the right path, which is actually pointing out that really this is not the right path, and this isn't justice, this isn't good, this isn't something that someone who's gentle and kind, what they would do. So yeah, but beyond that, pretty similar. And again, just the blame is being emphasized here again. Take the blame. See yourself reflected and not corrected. I'll take the blame, but then it's repeated so much that while there is this I here, it almost as a standalone feels like what they're actually though saying is take the blame. And that sort of brings up an interesting thing about poetic writing. A big thing with poetry is there's line breaks. You have your lines. A full sentence, would be like this. But poetry chops it up and then stacks it like that. And a big thing is with starting poets is not knowing when to do these line breaks. When do you start the next line? One thing that, can be a good basis is the rhythm. So if you're writing an iambic pentameter, you have your 5 iambic feet, where it goes unstressed, then stressed, unstressed, stressed, and so forth. And so then you do the next line once you've hit 5. Similarly, like with haiku, you can do it by syllable. So it goes like 5 syllable, 7 syllable, 5 syllable. So that tells you when to do your line break. But if you're doing a poetic form where you don't have a clear rhythm like that, well, how do you know then when to do your line break? And the thing is since there's no real rules, you can be pretty creative with it. So for example, you have to ask yourself, since crucifix and fix this, those rhyme, right? Not aisle. Aisle doesn't rhyme with crucifix. So why is aisle there? Why doesn't it go, nail me to your crucifix, end line, nothing else can fix this, end line, I'll take the blame? I would argue that there's something really interesting and creative being done here, which is that they've intentionally left aisle up here so that when you're looking at this line and this first letter of the line is capitalized, it actually feels like they're not saying I'll take the blame, but they're actually saying take the blame. Take the blame, see yourself reflected. It's actually suddenly now gone from, I'll take the blame, to being this like very active demand. Now the protagonist, the narrator, the hero of this piece, they're the ones saying you take the blame. So I think that's what's being done here, which is extremely interesting and sort of one of the major reasons why this piece sort of gets to be qualified for the series of the poetic genius of. I hope this is something that you can see and then take and, steal and put into your own writing. Think about where you put the subject, because, our sentence, we have the subject, the verb, and then the object. And the object is the object of the verb. So, he throws the ball. He is the subject, throws is the verb, and then the ball is the object. So if you break these up into different sentences, you start to get different implications, different meanings, because it gets the double meaning. It sort of gets, its cake and gets to eat it too, because we still have the I'll, so we both get the interpretation of them saying, like, I'll take the blame. So they get to say that, and they also get to say, basically, you take the blame. Take the blame. So yeah, I just think that's pretty cool. And then here we have our post-chorus, which goes break, 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 freighting, take me down, do you love me, break, 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 do you love me, break, 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 me down, break, 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 freighting, oh no, do you love me, break, 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 do you love me, break, break, one request, it's. Now this is an interesting part because one, it shows how repetition of one word in a poem can sort of act almost like a sort of visual, let's say like stage direction, because basically what this is telling us is that the act of breaking was not one action that was done, but it was done over and over and over and over again. So we can get that this is sort of like an arduous, like extreme moment. But man, there's a lot of like interesting sort of like iceberg theory. We may only be seeing the tip of the iceberg here, because we get freighting, which seems like a freighting, I think, unless you think there could be a different word. I'm trying to like run through the dictionary really quickly in my head, and the first thing that comes to mind is afraiding, which isn't really a thing. You scare someone, but afraid. But so like, well, what is? I think it's being done as freighting because it sounds like breaking. So, it's like a similar sound. But if you're afraiding, is that sort of an artistic way of saying scaring? Like by breaking, you're scaring me? Or is afraiding, since being afraid is being in the state of fear, if you're the one who gets scared, you're afraid. If you're the one scaring people, you're not afraid. So therefore, is freighting actually meaning like basically like an active tense version of saying like being in a state of fear? So like breaking, being afraid, take me down. Then we get the do you love me? So I'm kind of contradicting what I said earlier. And that's how you can tell these are authentically done line by line, because there actually seems to be a romantic element to it. This is an interesting part, because I feel like break in this part might actually be a bit of an innuendo. But that's all I'm going to get into with that, because I feel like that's above my pay grade. Maybe I'm reading too into it. Maybe I've been doing too much literary criticism, but I feel like there's sort of a repetitive action here. It feels like it could be an innuendo, if you know what I mean. But anyway, because there's the do you love me, and asking do you love me in this context, if the breaking was sort of a, let's say, a rough embrace of a sort, asking do you love me kind of makes sense in that context in a weird way, where it's sort of like this is a toxic relationship and it's physical, but I have like a wondering of if it's emotional as well, or is it just physical? So almost as a post-course, you almost wonder if this sort of act of breaking is almost prejudgment in a way, where there might be a cycle going on, where there might be this sort of physical aspect to the relationship between these two people, and then afterwards the other person acts like all judgmental and mean to the other person, even though they're both part of this, because it's take me down, do you love me, break, 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 do you love me? But then there's this freighting line. I don't know if this is like supposed to be put later in the story where, okay, this is now where the sentence has been passed and we're now getting to the execution, or like I said, or if this is almost cyclical of like they go back and forth between this sort of participating in this, but then there's a hypocrisy of after the fact the other person's cold and ignores the other person and tells lies about their ex and all that, but then they get back together, but then he acts like, oh no, oh her, I have no interest in her, blah blah blah, and there's the hypocrisy as a result of that. But that's really all I'm going to get into at this point. So then we get the bridge, which goes, I see your sins and they're in your soul. Consume and ignore, decay to your core. I'll never win to you, but within, yeah, you'll break, 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 break. And when I break, 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 you will break, 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 break. And in your hands, the hammer pounds the nail in. So to briefly go over some rhyme scheme stuff before we get into this, we have core and ignore, within, doesn't really rhyme, nail in, within, Yule and soul don't rhyme, but they look like they might because they're the OU. I will hands, there's nothing really there. And then obviously we get the repetitive sound of break there. But this passage is interesting. So we end again on another sort of Jesus image. But what's interesting is like the act of crucifixion is less about breaking. Because, like there's like the medieval whole like being broken on the wheel, I think is like one of the old medieval methods. But with the Jesus one, you hammer the hands and the legs to the wood, but it's, there's definitely some breaking going on because it like stretches your ribs and stuff, but it's not really break. So here I do want to highlight that like there may be a little bit of innuendo here. So like I don't know if we're weirdly supposed to almost interpret this as being sort of like a weird sort of like portrait of the dynamic of a relationship that is sort of toxic and physical. I feel like if I had to write a thesis essay on this, that would be sort of my thesis statement. My thesis statement would sort of be, this song, Martyr, serves as the portrait of the dynamic of a relationship that is both toxic and physical. It's physical with the sort of breaking imagery and all that stuff. And I mean sort of like intimate physical rather than abusive physical, if that makes sense. But the toxic is that like this clearly isn't a healthy relationship because there's a whole lot going on. I see your sins and they're in your soul. What's interesting here is like, again, there's sort of a level of closeness by being able to peer into someone's soul. Consume and ignore, decay to your core. I'll never win to you. This one's interesting because like, what is winning in the context of this? That seems like based on how we're interpreting this sort of dynamic relationship, whatever you want to call it, what would winning be in this? I'll never win like you're honest affection, or like when all of you, because there seems to sort of be a dynamic of like lies and acting like you're not actually interested in each other or something like that. But then we have, what's interesting is then the switching of the I and you here. So we have you'll break, and when I break, you will. What's interesting is this can be read in two different ways. So you can either read it as they are both participating in the breaking. So it's like, first you break me, then I break you, and it creates this cycle. Or since the word break, if you can break something. So you can break something, right? But you can also, but that something can also break, which has the same meaning as that. So I don't know if it's saying like, I am the one breaking, or as in like, I am breaking something else, or if it is saying like, I am breaking because of like the actions of something else. Does that make sense? You can break a cookie in half, or the cookie breaks in half, but in both examples, at the end of it, the cookie is split into two. But it could also then be that third one where it's like, you break me, then I break you. So there's like that sort of reflection thing that we're seeing earlier in the song, where there's sort of a duality. They both have the scars. What are the scars from? Well, the scars might be from this sort of act of like mutual sort of destruction in a way. If they are both breaking each other, then they would both have scars, but then at the end, only one acknowledges those scars while the other pretends not to have those scars. And if these scars and this breaking could have to do with like physical intimacy, then you could read this all as being basically like two people get together, and by getting together they are, quote unquote breaking and leaving scars. The scars could even be sort of like an emotional hangover after that moment of connection. But then afterwards, even though they both have that emotional hangover, only one is honest about having that emotional hangover, while the other not only pretends not to have it, but then like casts shame and lies about the other person. Because like using your hands, I don't know. I just saw Wuthering Heights in the movie theater, so maybe I'm bringing in too much of that. Speaking of weird comparisons, I also feel like with this whole piece, I've been reading Shakespeare's Henriade, which takes place sort of as like before the War of the Roses and then sort of during the War of the Roses. And as a result, I've been doing some research on the War of the Roses and reading about like, this is kind of past War of the Roses, but then reading about like Henry VIII and how he would cast blame on his many wives, and then which ranged from like political to like cheating to all sorts of stuff, witchcraft even, and then he would execute them. And I feel like there's weirdly that imagery sort of fits within the context of the song. I'm not saying the song's about Henry VIII, but what I'm saying is that it seems to be channeling of a sort of similar dynamic between its characters, if you will. So then we have our chorus and our outro. So the chorus is repeating what we saw earlier with don't be gentle, don't be kind when you murder, when you murder the martyr, poke their eyes out, leave them blind. Murder, one request, it's... But then we get this outro, and the fact that the chorus still ends with one request, it's, meaning that it goes one request, it's, I have one request of you. I want to ask, do you love me? Again, do you love me? Again. One request, it's do you love me again, again? Do you love me again? So here it seems this is so interesting that the piece ultimately ends on this question of do you love me? Because before this request seemed to be one request, acknowledge the hypocrisy. But now instead it's I just want to know, do you love me? And again, with the sort of written out way of all of this, kind of feel like some of the innuendos we were reading into, I think we were correct in our assessment of that. Or at least you could make a very solid argument for it. But this ending is sort of dark in a way, because I would argue now that this is a portrait of the dynamic in a toxic, kind of confusing physical relationship, that there's two people, they get together, then they separate, there's all this toxic lying about the relationship, and then they get back together again. And I feel like at the end here, they're getting back together again, even though this person has been, brutal and murder and lying and saying all this terrible stuff. Our hero, our sort of narrator, can't help but in the end wonder if this judge character loves them, and that's like what's on their mind. Of course, you could also read the don't be gentle, don't be kind as having to do with sort of that physical dynamic, let's say, that has to be acknowledged. But yeah, I think we kind of got maybe to the root of this, or at least, my interpretation of it, which sort of brings us to sort of our final little debrief. So yeah, that kind of wraps this one up. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode and you enjoy this sort of content, please consider subscribing. It really helps. It also kind of helps give me the feedback of if I see people subscribing, I know you're enjoying this content and want more of it. But here's where, things get good. So I would love to hear your thoughts on the song. So I kind of ended on kind of a wild interpretation at the end. I kind of feel like that wasn't the interpretation I thought I was going to end up at. So I'm really curious, what are your thoughts on it? Do you agree with my interpretation? Do you disagree? And if so, why? Let me know in the comments, because I feel like this one has a lot of room for interpretation, and as a result, I feel like some of you probably got a totally different interpretation of this song from me, and so I'd love to hear what that is. I kind of want to hear a totally different perspective and a different take. So yeah, or if you agree, I'd love to hear that, because I'll know I'm not totally crazy then. So yeah, I think that's going to wrap this one up. So take care, and I will see you in the next one.